The bell tower had been silent for 3 months before Mabel Hawthorne decided she had waited long enough for someone else to fix it. It was the kind of silence that settled into a town like dust after a long, dry summer. You stopped noticing it after a while, the way you stopped noticing an empty chair at the supper table, until one day you looked up and the absence hit you square in the chest like a thrown stone. That was how it was with the bell tower at the Harlow Creek schoolhouse in the autumn of 1878. The iron bell had cracked during a September storm when lightning struck the wooden frame and split two of the support beams clean down the middle. And since then, the children of Harlow Creek had been herded to their lessons each morning by their mothers hollering from porches, by the distant crow of roosters, by nothing at all except habit and the fear of the schoolmistress's ruler. The town had talked about fixing it, the way towns talk about fixing things at great length, with considerable enthusiasm, and without any particular result. Mabel Hawthorne had been listening to that talk since September. By the second Tuesday of November, she had stopped listening and started gathering rope. She was 31 years old, which she considered neither young nor old, but simply the age she happened to be, and she had the kind of face that people remembered not because it was conventionally beautiful, but because it was honest. Strong jaw, brown eyes the color of creek water after a rain, hands that had been soft once, a long time ago, before 2 years of farming alone had worked them into something harder and more capable. Her husband, Thomas Hawthorne, had died of a fever in the spring of 1876, leaving her with 40 acres on the eastern edge of Harlow Creek, a milk cow named Prudence, a mule named Senator, and a grief so large she had spent the first 6 months of her widowhood convinced she would simply dissolve into the Kansas plains and no one would notice. She had not dissolved. She had planted corn instead, and then she had harvested it, and then she had done it again the following year. And by the autumn of 1878, she had developed the particular kind of competence that comes not from talent but from necessity, which is the most durable kind of all. She arrived at the schoolhouse that Tuesday morning before the sun had properly committed to rising. The sky was the color of a bruise healing toward yellow along the eastern horizon, and the air had the sharp bite of a November that meant business. Mabel wore her work coat, a heavy canvas thing that had belonged to Thomas and that she had taken in at the seams herself, and she had her toolbox with her, and 3 lengths of good hemp rope, and a bucket of pitch she had mixed the night before by lamplight while trying not to think too hard about what she was attempting. She stood at the base of the tower and looked up. The tower was not, technically speaking, extremely tall. It rose perhaps 30 feet above the roofline of the schoolhouse, which was itself a single-story building of limestone and mortar. But 30 feet looks considerably different from the ground when you are the person who is going to climb it, and Mabel spent a full minute simply looking before she tied the first length of rope around her waist and knotted it to the ladder's iron railing. "You are doing this," she said to herself, in the quiet, practical way she had developed of talking herself through difficult tasks. "The children need to get to school on time and no one else is going to do it. You are doing this." She climbed. The broken beams were worse close up than they had appeared from below. The lightning had done genuine structural damage, and Mabel, who had learned more than she ever expected about timber framing from the books Thomas had kept, worked slowly and carefully, testing each plank before she put her weight on it. She had brought fresh-cut oak boards on Senator's back, and she worked methodically, prying out the shattered wood and fitting the new planks with the mallet and iron spikes she had carried up in her canvas bag, stopping every so often to check her knots and her footing and to breathe. The sun climbed with her. By the time it was fully up, she had replaced both split beams and was working on the iron bracket that held the bell. The crack in the bell itself was a separate problem she could not solve. She had written to a foundry in Wichita 3 weeks ago about recasting it, and they had written back with a price that made her set the letter down and stare at the wall for a while. But the mounting could be repaired so that when the new bell arrived, if it ever did, the tower would be ready. She was so absorbed in her work that she did not hear the horse until it was quite close. Morning. The voice was low and unhurried, the voice of a man who was not in a particular rush and did not feel apologetic about it. Mabel looked down from her position on the repaired frame, her mallet still in hand, and found herself looking at a man on a gray roan horse who was looking back up at her with an expression she could not entirely decipher from 30 feet up, but that appeared to contain a significant quantity of surprise. He was broad in the shoulders, dark-haired under a battered brown hat, and somewhere in his middle 30s if she had to guess. She had seen him before in the way that everyone in a small territory knew everyone else, from a distance, at the general store, at church on Sundays when she attended, which was not every Sunday because sometimes the corn or the sky or the sheer exhaustion of being herself required her to stay home. His name, she was fairly certain, was Mercer. He had a cattle ranch about 2 miles south of her farm, and she knew his spread by sight more than by acquaintance. "Morning," she said back, because there was nothing else sensible to say. He looked at the new board she had fitted, at the rope around her waist, at the toolbox on the platform beside her. He looked at all of this for a long moment. "You need a hand up there?" he asked. "I have managed so far," she said. "I can see that." There was no condescension in his voice. It was an observation offered simply. "I was just wondering if an extra pair of hands might make the bracket go faster." Mabel considered the bracket. It was, in fact, being stubborn. The iron had swelled with the season changes, and the bolt she needed to set was resisting her with the particular mulish energy of metal that had decided it was staying where it was. "You know iron work?" she asked. "Some," he said. "My father was a blacksmith." She thought about it for another moment, which was longer than she strictly needed, because she had already made up her mind. "The ladder's on the east side," she said. He tied his horse to the fence post and climbed the ladder with the easy confidence of a man comfortable with heights, which she noted without comment. When he reached the platform, he had to duck under the frame, and she got her first proper look at him up close. He had a square, weathered face, honest the way a plowed field is honest, with dark eyes that looked at things steadily and directly, without the quality of looking past them that she had noticed in men who were somewhere else in their heads. He was wearing a blue work shirt under his coat, and his hands, she noticed, were the hands of someone who did physical labor, large and capable and marked by it. "Arthur Mercer," he said. "I know who you are," she said. "Mabel Hawthorne." "I know who you are too," he said, and reached for the bolt without ceremony. They worked together for the better part of an hour. Arthur had been right that he knew iron work. He did not fumble or second-guess himself. And between the two of them they set the bracket properly and true. And then he held the broken bell housing steady, while she fitted the new iron brace she had forged herself 2 days before in the small smithing setup she had built behind her barn. The sun was well up by then, and the children had begun arriving at the schoolhouse below, pointing up at the tower with the frank curiosity of children who had absolutely no idea that staring was rude and no particular intention of learning. "Miss Hawthorne is fixing the bell," one of them shouted, a boy of about 10 with a gap between his front teeth and tremendous enthusiasm for stating what was in front of him. "I can see that, Eli," said a woman's voice below, and Mabel looked down to see Miss Clara Webb, the schoolteacher, standing at the schoolhouse door with her arms crossed and her expression one of controlled amazement. Clara was 24 years old, quick and bright, and she had been teaching in Harlow Creek for 2 years with a dedication that made Mabel think of a woman trying to fill an ocean with a good strong bucket. "Good morning, Mrs. Hawthorne, Mr. Mercer." "Morning, Miss Webb," Arthur called down. "The bell ought to ring when the new one arrives," Mabel called. "I have written to Wichita." "I see that," Clara said, and the amazement in her voice had shifted into something warmer. "Come in for coffee when you are done, both of you, please." They came down when the work was finished. Mabel's shoulders ached in a way that would become a serious complaint by tomorrow morning, But she carried herself straight as she always did, because slouching was a habit she had never permitted herself, and did not intend to start now. The children had gone inside, and the schoolroom was warm and smelled of chalk and wood smoke, and Clara had set 3 cups on her desk and a tin pot of coffee strong enough to stand up on its own. Arthur Mercer sat across from Mabel at the desk and wrapped both hands around his cup, and she thought there was something very natural and uncomplicated about the way he occupied space, not taking up more than he needed, not apologizing for existing. It was restful somehow. She had been around a lot of men since Thomas died who seemed to fall into one of 2 categories: men who could not look at her without obvious sympathy that felt like pity dressed in its good clothes, and men who could not look at her without assessing whether she might be a practical solution to their domestic requirements. Arthur Mercer seemed to be neither. He looked at her the way she imagined he looked at most things, directly, with attention, without an obvious agenda. "I heard the foundry in Wichita quoted you a price," Clara said. "They did," Mabel said. "Is it bad?" "It is what it is." She said it without complaint because complaining about prices at a schoolteacher's desk felt unproductive. "The town council should pay for it," Arthur said. Both women looked at him. "The schoolhouse is a public building," he said. "The bell is a public bell. Harrington and his lot have been sitting on the maintenance fund for 2 years. I have seen the accounts." He said it in a flat, factual way, the way someone states that the sky is above and the ground is below. "I'll speak to Roy Harrington myself this week." "He does not enjoy being spoken to," Clara said carefully. "No," Arthur agreed, "he does not. That has never stopped it being necessary." Mabel studied him over the rim of her cup. "You have a talent for direct speech," she said. The corner of his mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile but was in the general vicinity of one. "My mother called it a lack of patience for foolishness," he said. Mabel thought that she had liked his mother already, and then she realized she had just thought something quite warm about a man she had met fewer than 2 hours ago, and she took a longer sip of coffee than was strictly necessary and looked at the chalkboard instead, where someone had written the day's arithmetic problem in Clara's neat hand. Arthur Mercer rode back to his ranch after the coffee, and Mabel loaded her tools onto Senator's back and walked the 2 miles home through the cold morning air. And if she thought about the way he had steadied the bracket with his large, careful hands and said, simply and without fuss, that the town council should pay for it, well, that was her business and nobody else's. The rest of the week passed the way weeks pass in Kansas in November, with work and cold and the short hard light of a sun that had better things to do than linger. Mabel mended fences on Wednesday, which she despised. She drove Senator to the feed store in town on Thursday and stopped at the general store for flour and salt and lamp oil, and Mr. Elia's pond behind the counter told her, with the particular delight of a man who considers information to be a form of currency, that Arthur Mercer had gone to see Roy Harrington on Wednesday afternoon, and that the conversation had been, in Elia's word, vigorous. "Did he get anywhere?" Mabel asked, measuring out her meaning carefully. "Roy's agreed to release $40 from the maintenance fund for the bell," Elia said, nodding as if he had personally negotiated it. "Said it was the schoolhouse's responsibility after all, which everyone knew. Just took someone to say it to his face." Mabel paid for her flour and her salt and her lamp oil. "Good," she said. She said it to herself as much as to Elia's pond, and she walked out into the cold November street and stood for a moment with Senator's reins in her hand and 40 Kansas acres and a cracked school bell and 1 cup of coffee shared at a schoolteacher's desk, and the particular warm weight of a thing she could not quite name, yet sitting somewhere behind her sternum. She drove home and made cornbread for supper and read for an hour by lamplight, which was the luxury she permitted herself each evening, the one thing she had held onto from the life she and Thomas had had together: his books, his reading lamp, the worn velvet chair that had come from his mother's house, and that she had reupholstered herself with a remnant of blue cloth she had ordered from a dry goods catalog. She read one of his history books without really absorbing it, and went to bed and lay awake listening to the Kansas wind, doing what it always did to the eaves, and thought about a man with a square, honest face, who had climbed a ladder without making a ceremony of it, and spoken to Roy Harrington without being asked. Friday brought an unexpected visitor. She was in the barn checking on Prudence. The cow had been off her feed, and Mabel suspected it was nothing more than the cold affecting her disposition, which Mabel considered relatable. When she heard boots on the packed earth outside and looked up to find Arthur Mercer at the barn door, hat in hand. She noticed the hat in hand. Men in Harlow Creek did not generally remove their hats for widows doing barn work. They did it for ladies in parlors or for church, but not for women in barns with straw in their hair. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "Mrs. Hawthorne, I am sorry to interrupt your morning. I had a reason for coming by and I did not want to wait until Sunday." He paused and looked at the cow and then back at her. "I heard from the foundry in Wichita this morning. I had written them separately after Tuesday. They have agreed to reduce the price, given that the county school board is officially commissioning the repair. The $40 from Roy should cover it with a little to spare." Mabel set down her brush and straightened up. "You wrote to the foundry?" "Yes." "On behalf of the school?" "Yes." She looked at him for a moment. "You did not have to do that," she said. "No," he agreed. "I did not have to." He said it simply, without the particular note of self-congratulation that would have made it intolerable. "But I was riding past on Tuesday and I watched you up on that tower in the cold, and it seemed to me that someone ought to do something useful in response to that." Mabel found she did not have an immediate answer. It was a rare condition. "The bell should arrive by the first week of December," Arthur continued, as if her silence were entirely comfortable, which apparently he had decided it was. "I volunteered to collect it from the rail depot in Salina when it comes. I thought you might want to know." "Thank you," she said, and then, because she had been raised to be hospitable even when hospitality required effort, "Would you like coffee? I have a pot on inside." He would, it turned out. He did not say it immediately. He gave the question a beat of consideration that she found she appreciated, because it suggested he was not assuming, was not taking for granted, and then he said yes, thank you, he would like that. They sat at her kitchen table, which was not the schoolteacher's desk, and therefore carried a different quality, a different weight of informality. And Mabel poured the coffee and put the sugar bowl between them and thought about how long it had been since she had had a person sitting across from her at this table who was not her closest friend, Dorothy Crane, or the Reverend Aldous stopping by to check on her in the mournful and well-meaning way that ministers checked on widows. Arthur looked around the kitchen with the open, unobtrusive curiosity of someone who is interested in the world, without needing to comment on everything he notices. His eyes moved over the shelf of books, the repaired window frame she had done herself in September, the jar of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling, the blue velvet chair visible through the door to the sitting room. "You have a lot of books," he said. "They were my husband's mostly, though I have added to them." She paused. "Do you read?" "When I can," he said. "The evenings in winter mostly. I have a small collection, nothing like this." He nodded at the shelf. "I've been working through a natural history of the Great Plains that a friend sent from Philadelphia. It's slow going in the busy months. What kind of ranch do you run?" She asked because she realized she did not actually know the details. "Cattle, mainly. I have about 300 head right now, which is smaller than I would like and larger than I expected when I started. I have been in Harlow Creek 4 years. He wrapped his hands around his cup. "I came from Ohio originally, before that Missouri." "What brought you here?" "Land," he said. "The same thing that brings most people." He was quiet for a moment. "And the need to be somewhere that wasn't where I had been, which I suspect is also the same thing that brings most people, even if they don't say it that way." Mabel thought about that. "My husband and I came from Indiana," she said. "He wanted the land and I wanted to want it, and after a while I did. Genuinely. There is something about this country that gets into you." "Yes," Arthur said, "there is." They talked for longer than either of them had planned. They talked about the winter coming in and whether it would be a hard one, and about the Kansas Pacific Railroad and what it was doing to the cattle trade, and about a book of poems she had on the shelf that had been Thomas's, but that she had read so many times the binding was soft, and about the problem of Roy Harrington and the town council's habit of spending money on the things men wanted and ignoring the things women and children needed. "The schoolhouse roof leaked all last spring," Mabel said. "Miss Webb caught buckets in the corner for 6 weeks before the council agreed it was worth repairing." "I know," Arthur said. "I was on the council briefly last year and resigned because the amount of time spent discussing the road to the saloon versus the road to the school was more than I could sit through without losing my temper." "You resigned," she said. "It seemed more honest than staying." She looked at him. "Most men would have stayed and just complained about it." "Most men," he said, and his tone was dry enough to start a fire, "would have fixed the road to the saloon." She laughed. It came out before she knew it was coming, a genuine laugh, full and unguarded, and she felt the strange shock of it in her own chest. The way a laugh you have not let yourself have in a while lands differently than ordinary laughter, with more weight and more warmth both at once. Arthur Mercer smiled when she laughed. Not the polished smile of a man performing charm, but the slow, real smile of a man who is genuinely pleased, which was different and more dangerous, and Mabel was very much aware of the difference. He stood to go shortly after, setting his cup in the basin without being asked to, which she filed away with the hatch removal and the ladder climbing and the speaking to Roy Harrington as data points that were forming a picture she was not yet willing to look at directly. "I'll let you know when the bell arrives," he said at the door. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it." He nodded, unhurried, and went out into the gray Kansas afternoon, and Mabel stood in her kitchen doorway and watched his horse carry him down the road until the cold convinced her to go back inside. Saturday morning, Dorothy Crane arrived with a pan of sweet rolls and an expression that suggested she had heard something and intended to discuss it. Dorothy was 43 and had the round, warm face of a woman who had decided that honesty was kinder than tact and lived accordingly. She had been Mabel's best friend since the first week Mabel arrived in Harlow Creek, when Dorothy had appeared on her doorstep with a ham and a no-nonsense welcome that had been the most useful thing anyone had done for her in that hard first year. "I heard you climbed the Schoolbell Tower," Dorothy said, unwrapping her coat. "I did," Mabel said, "and that Arthur Mercer helped you." "He was passing and offered." Dorothy set the sweet rolls on the table and looked at Mabel with the particular expression she had that combined warm affection with absolute refusal to pretend she wasn't thinking what she was thinking. "He was passing at dawn on a Tuesday. The road to his south pasture runs by the schoolhouse," Mabel said Dorothy. "He also wrote to the foundry in Wichita to arrange for the bell." Dorothy's eyebrows moved. "Did he? And he came by Friday morning to tell me." "To tell you, Dorothy," Mabel said. "I am not saying anything," Dorothy said, in the voice of a woman who was, in fact, saying quite a lot. "He is a neighbor," Mabel said. "Good neighbor. He speaks plainly, and he does useful things without making a performance of them, and he resigned from the town council rather than watch Roy Harrington ignore the school roof, which I consider admirable." Dorothy reached for a sweet roll and broke it open with the serenity of someone who knows she has all day. "He is also 40 acres south of here and unattached, and I believe his mother has been writing him letters about grandchildren since at least 1876. "How do you know that?" "Francis Odom at the post office has a very good memory for return addresses," Dorothy said comfortably. "His mother is in Columbus, Ohio. She writes monthly." Mabel picked up a sweet roll and sat down and considered whether this information was relevant to anything she needed to think about, and decided that it was not specifically and that she was going to eat the sweet roll and talk about something else. "The corn prices in Salina have dropped again," she said. "They have," Dorothy agreed. "Mabel." "What?" "You laughed yesterday." Mabel stopped chewing. "Eli Crane was walking past your fence line on his way to the Patterson place, and he heard you laughing in your kitchen," Dorothy said, not unkindly. He told me because he thought it was a good sound. She paused. It has been a while since Eli or I have heard that sound from this particular kitchen. Mabel looked down at the sweet roll in her hands. It was true. She knew it was true. She had been aware of it herself on Friday, the shock of the laugh and what it had felt like to let it happen, the slight guilt of it, the way she had caught herself wondering whether laughing that freely was some kind of betrayal of Thomas's memory, and then the second thought that followed, which was that Thomas had loved her laugh and would have considered its absence the greater loss. "He is a good man," she said quietly. "I think." "I think so too," Dorothy said. "From what I know of him, which is not nothing. He pays his workers fairly, which I cannot say of everyone in this county. He bought extra corn from the Hernandez family last year when they had a rough time, and told them it was the market price when everyone knew it was not. He does not drink in ways that cause trouble." She paused. "He also has very good manners in the way that is not about putting on a show but is just about actually seeing people, which is the best kind." Mabel was quiet. Outside the kitchen window the Kansas morning was gray and cold and still, and Prudence was doing something in the barn that suggested she had recovered her appetite, which was reassuring. "I am not ready," Mabel said. It was the first time she had said it plainly. Not to Dorothy, not to herself, not out loud in any room. "I do not know if I can do it again. Love someone and then have them leave. Even just the ordinary risk of it. It is such a large risk." "Yes," Dorothy said without softening it or arguing with it. "It is." "Thomas was 33, Mabel said. "He was strong and healthy, and one morning he had a fever and within 2 weeks he was gone. There was no logic to it." "No," Dorothy agreed, "there was not. So what is the argument for doing it again?" Dorothy was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The same thing there ever was, that the size of the grief is the size of the love. And that the love was worth it." Mabel sat with that for a long time. Dorothy, who understood the value of silence as a thing offered between friends, let her. Sunday morning came up clear and cold and bright, with the particular diamond-hard quality of late November sunlight in Kansas that does not warm so much as illuminate. Everything very sharp and very visible. The frost on the grass blades and the bare branches of the cottonwoods along the creek, and the pale blue sky that went on forever in every direction. Mabel dressed for church in her gray wool dress and her good coat, braided her dark hair, looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand, and then walked the 1.5 miles to the Harlow Creek Methodist Church with her hands in her pockets and her breath making small clouds in the cold air. The congregation was its usual Sunday collection of farmers and shopkeepers and their families, the particular social fabric of a small western town, woven from proximity and necessity. The Reverend Aldous spoke about the parable of the talents, which Mabel always thought was more interesting than people gave it credit for, and the choir sang 2 hymns with the kind of sincere effort that more than compensates for technical imperfection. She was aware, in the way that you become aware of things you have been trying not to be aware of, that Arthur Mercer was 3 pews ahead of her on the left side of the aisle. He had his hat on his knee, and he sat straight but not stiff, and he sang the hymns in a low, quiet voice that she could just barely hear when the woman in front of him was not drowning everything out with her considerably more enthusiastic alto. She studied the back of his head for a moment, and then directed her attention firmly to the Reverend Aldous, and kept it there for the rest of the service. After church, the congregation gathered outside in the sunlight in the way they always did, shaking hands and exchanging the week's news and debating the weather, which in Kansas was always a subject of genuine interest. Mabel spoke to Dorothy and to old Mrs. Patterson and to Clara Webb, who told her that the children had written her a card to thank her for fixing the tower, which Mabel found unexpectedly affecting. She was about to go for her horse when Arthur Mercer appeared at her shoulder. He must have worked his way across the churchyard deliberately, which she noted. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said, "good morning." "Good morning, Mr. Mercer." He looked at her for a moment in the clear Sunday light, and she had the sense that he was working up to something, which was slightly interesting because he had not seemed to her, over the course of their acquaintance, like a man who needed to work up to things. He said them when they were ready to be said. It was one of the things she had noticed and approved of. "I was wondering," he said, "if you would consider having supper with me. Not formally. I mean at the hotel dining room on, say, Saturday evening, if you are willing. If it would not be if you would like to." He was not fumbling exactly, but there was a quality to his speech that was different from the easy directness she had come to associate with him, and she realized with a jolt that traveled through her like cold water that he was nervous. Arthur Mercer, who had spoken to Roy Harrington's face and climbed her bell tower and written to the Wichita Foundry with calm efficiency, was nervous about asking her to supper. She looked at him. He looked back, steady in the eyes, the way he always was, but with that particular quality of someone who has laid something down and is waiting to learn whether it will be received or returned. "Yes," she said. "I would like that." The something that had lived in her chest since Tuesday, unnamed and carefully not named, spread out a little, warm and complicated and real. She felt it and did not argue with it. Saturday evening arrived with the deliberateness of Saturday evenings when something is expected of them. Mabel took out her good dress, the dark blue wool she had made from cloth that Thomas had bought her the Christmas before he died, and that she had saved, not for any specific occasion, but because wearing it felt like spending down a treasure and she had not wanted to spend it carelessly. She looked at it for a long time and then she put it on, because if not now, then when? And because she thought Thomas would have wanted her to wear the blue dress rather than keep folding it back into the cedar chest forever. She put her hair up, not in the serviceable braid she wore for work, but in the softer arrangement she had once known how to do and had almost forgotten how to do. And she borrowed Dorothy's good tortoiseshell combs, which Dorothy had pressed on her with a completeness of enthusiasm that suggested Dorothy had been waiting for this since at least Wednesday. She walked to the hotel because it was not far and the night was clear, and she was aware with every step of the strangeness of it, the feeling of doing something she had not done in years, of moving towards something instead of simply moving through it. The grief was still there. She did not expect it to not be. But it had the quality, that evening, of something that had shifted slightly to the side and allowed her to see past it. The Harlow Creek Hotel dining room was the nicest establishment in town, which was a relative designation but not entirely without merit. It had 4 round tables with clean white cloths, and a fireplace that worked properly, and a cook named Mathilda who had come from Louisiana, and who had opinions about seasoning that had caused a minor revolution in the culinary landscape of central Kansas. Arthur was already there when Mabel arrived, standing by the door in a dark coat she had not seen on him before, his hat in his hand, and when he saw her he did that thing again, the slow, real smile that was different from charm and more lasting than performance. "You look beautiful," he said, and then appeared slightly surprised at himself for saying it with such directness, which Mabel found charming. "Thank you," she said. "You look well yourself." Mathilda brought them beef and roasted vegetables and bread, and a kind of apple cake for dessert that was better than anything Mabel had eaten in longer than she wanted to admit, and they talked for 2 hours, which did not feel like 2 hours, which was always the measure of a good conversation. She learned more things about him. He had grown up the second of 5 children in Columbus, Ohio, his father a blacksmith and his mother a teacher, which explained both the ironwork and the reading. He had come west at 26 after a property dispute with a man he had gone into business with had left him with less money and more resolve, and the conviction that he needed to own his own land outright or not at all. He had worked cattle drives for 2 years before he had saved enough to buy the Harlow Creek land, and those 2 years had, he said, taught him everything he needed to know about both cattle and the limits of his patience for other people's bad judgment. "Were you ever?" Mabel paused. She was not sure how to ask it without making it a question about her. "Were you ever married?" He shook his head. "I was engaged once, in Missouri, before I came west." He said it carefully, not as if it caused him pain, but as if he was considering how much was relevant. "She married someone else while I was on the first cattle drive. I cannot say it was entirely wrong of her. I had been gone 8 months and written 4 letters, which was not attentive. I have wondered since whether I was in love with her or in love with the idea of being settled, which is not the same thing, and it is important to know the difference." "Yes," Mabel said, "it is." "And you?" he asked. "If you are willing to speak of it." She told him about Thomas. She had told the story before, to Dorothy and to the Reverend and to her mother in letters to Indiana. But she told it differently that night. Not the summary version, not the grief-sanitized version, but the fuller one. What Thomas had been like, his enthusiasms and his stubbornness, and the way he read aloud from his books when he was excited about something, and did not always check whether she was listening, which had sometimes driven her wild with impatience, and which she would now give almost anything to hear again. How they had argued about whether to come west, and how she had come around to it. The fever and the 2 weeks, and the way the world had continued to look exactly the same after he died while being fundamentally different in every particular. Arthur listened the way he looked at things steadily, with complete attention, without trying to fix it or redirect it or offer something consoling before it was asked for. "He sounds like someone worth knowing," he said when she had finished. "He was," she said. "He was a good man." She looked down at her apple cake. "I am learning that saying that without the sound of a whole grief attached to it takes a long time." "Yes," Arthur said, "I imagine it does. But it is getting there," she said, slowly. "Good," he said, and said it with a warmth that she felt in her chest. They walked out of the hotel together into the cold, clear night, and the stars were enormous and sharp-edged in the way they are only in open country far from any city, and Mabel stopped for a moment on the board sidewalk and looked up at them. Arthur stopped beside her. They stood in companionable quiet for a moment, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold air. "I would like to see you again," he said. More formally than fixing bell towers. "I would like that too," she said. He offered to walk her home, and she let him, because the night was beautiful and she was not ready for it to end. And they walked the 1.5 miles to her farm along the moonlit road and talked about the stars and the coming winter, and whether the Kansas Pacific was a blessing or a catastrophe for small farmers. And when they reached her gate, he said good night in a way that was warm and direct, and entirely without the awkward pressing quality that some men had when they said good night. And she went inside feeling something that it took her a moment to identify correctly. She felt light. Not weightless, the weight was still there, the grief, the responsibility, the 40 acres and the morning work and all of it, but lighter than she had been, as if something had shifted in the balance. She put the kettle on and sat in Thomas's velvet chair and read for a while, but she was not really reading, and after a while she set the book down and sat in the warmth of the lamp and let herself simply feel what she felt, which was something like the beginning of a new thing, tentative and warm and real. December arrived. The bell arrived 3 days later than expected, on a Friday, because the rail depot in Salina had had a delay, and Arthur rode out to collect it as promised and delivered it to the schoolhouse on his wagon, which required some complicated maneuvering because the bell was heavier than expected, and Mabel was already there when he arrived, having heard from Clara that it was coming. "Of course you are here," Arthur said when he saw her, without surprise or anything except a warmth that made her want to smile. "Of course I am," she said. "I wrote to the foundry in the first place." "You did," he said. "Will you help me hang it?" They hung the bell together. This required both of them up on the tower, which was somewhat more crowded than it had been in November but considerably warmer in spirit. And Clara stood below directing their efforts with a helpfulness that consisted mainly of telling them which angle looked most level from the ground and issuing occasional encouragements. When the bell was set, and the mounting was checked twice, and then a third time because Mabel was not a person who left work half-finished, Arthur pulled the rope. The bell rang out over Harlow Creek on a Friday afternoon in December, with a sound that was clear and round and deep, and carried across the cold plains like a voice that had been absent and was now returned. Below in the schoolroom there was a pause, and then an eruption of children's cheering that could be heard through the walls, and Clara clasped her hands together with the expression of a woman whose heart is genuinely full. 3 months, Clara said. I have been hollering at those children for 3 months. Your hollering has considerable range, Miss Webb, Arthur said. I went to a lot of effort to develop it, Clara said. Mabel laughed again, and it came more easily this time, and she looked sideways at Arthur on the platform beside her, and found him looking at her with that steady, warm attention, and the thing in her chest that had been warm and tentative all month became, in that moment, something less tentative. They saw each other regularly through December and into the winter of 1879. He came by on Sundays after church, usually with some practical excuse. He had seen a fence line that needed checking on the road near her property. He had an extra side of salt pork he thought she might want. And she stopped pretending not to notice the thinness of the excuses and started putting the coffee on when she saw his gray roan coming down the road. They took a sleigh ride on the last Sunday before Christmas along the creek road, which was Dorothy's suggestion executed through Clara, who had mentioned it to Arthur, which meant that by the time Arthur proposed the idea to Mabel it had passed through enough hands to give him plausible cover as though he had thought of it himself, which Mabel was entirely aware of and chose not to comment on. The sleigh ride was, objectively, one of the better hours of her recent life. The world was white and still, and the runners hissed over the packed snow, and the horse blew great clouds of steam into the air, and she and Arthur sat under a wool blanket she had brought from her linen chest and talked about everything and nothing, the way two people talk when they are comfortable enough with each other to let conversation be easy. He reached over at one point and tucked the blanket more firmly around her side without asking, a small gesture, practical and kind and neither a performance nor an imposition, and she let it happen and felt the warmth of his arm against her shoulder and thought, very clearly, in the way that clarity sometimes arrives unexpectedly and without negotiation, I am falling in love with this man. She did not say it. She thought it would be sensible to wait and be sure, because she was not impulsive by nature, and she was aware that loneliness can create resemblances. But she turned it over in the days that followed and found it to be solid, not resemblance but the real thing, and she found that knowing it did not frighten her as much as she had expected. It was still frightening. She was still aware of all the ways love required risk, and that risk was never guaranteed. But the fear sat smaller than the warmth, and she thought that was probably the answer Dorothy had been trying to give her when she said that the love was worth it. Christmas came and went, warm and quiet. She spent the day with Dorothy and her family, and ate too much and came home contented and slightly sleepy, and found that a basket had been left on her porch while she was out, a small basket, covered with a cloth, and inside it a jar of honey from Arthur's bees and a small, knee-trapped package that turned out to be a book, a collection of natural history essays from a publisher in Philadelphia, new, the pages crisp and uncut, and on the inside cover in a plain, good handwriting. For Mabel, who already knows more about the natural world than any book does, Happy Christmas, Arthur. She sat in the velvet chair with the book in her lap for a long time before she read a single word. January 1879 was cold in the way that Kansas Januaries have always been cold thoroughly, comprehensively, without apology. The creek froze and the cattle on Arthur's ranch stood in the lee of the windbreak he had planted and ate through his hay supply at a rate he had not budgeted for, because the winter had come in harder than the fall weather had suggested. He came by on a Tuesday to borrow her second sledge, which he had seen in her barn and which she did not use in winter, and she loaned it to him without ceremony, and then made him drink coffee before she let him go because he had ridden out in weather she considered unreasonable, and she did not feel like arguing with herself about why she was making him coffee before sending him back into it. They sat at the kitchen table, and outside the snow moved horizontally past the window, which was the Kansas special, and inside the stove ticked and the lamp made its yellow circle and the coffee was hot, and Arthur said, "This is a good kitchen." "It is a warm kitchen," she said. "That too." He looked around at it. "But I meant it is a good kitchen, a good place to be, the books and the herbs and I don't know how to say it, it has the quality of being lived in well." Mabel looked at him. "That is a very particular thing to notice," she said. "I have been noticing it for a while," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I have been noticing things about you too." He looked at her then, the steady, direct look that she had come to think of as entirely his own, and something passed between them that was not yet words but was considerably clearer than silence. "Is that so?" he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." He put his coffee cup down and leaned forward with his forearms on the table, not closing the distance so much as reducing it thoughtfully, and said, "Mabel, I would like to say something and I want to say it well, so I ask for your patience." "You have it," she said. "I have been in Harlow Creek for 4 years," he said, "and I have been content in those years in the way that a man with work he cares about can be content. But since November, since watching you up on that bell tower at dawn with your mallet and your rope, and your complete lack of interest in waiting for someone else to do it, I have been aware that content is not the word for what I would like to be. I do not want to hurry you. I am aware that you have had losses that I have not had, and that grief has its own schedule and does not consult anyone else's. But I wanted to be honest with you because you are the most honest person I have met in a long time, and it seems wrong to give you anything less in return." Mabel sat with that. Outside the snow moved in sheets. The stove ticked. "Thomas has been gone nearly 3 years," she said. "And I have spent most of those 3 years being very competent and very solitary and telling myself that was sufficient. Some days it was." She looked down at her hands around the coffee cup, the work-marked hands, the capable hands. "Some days it was not." "No," Arthur said softly. "I am not afraid of loving someone again," she said, which she had only understood to be true in the moment she said it. "I am afraid of the ordinary vulnerability of it, the way it requires you to put something important in another person's hands and trust them not to be careless with it." "Yes," he said, "I know that fear. But I think," she said, looking up at him, "that you are not a careless person." The way he looked at her then, it was not a dramatic look, not the look of a man in a painting. It was the look of a man who has been told something important and feels the full weight of it, and is not going to diminish it by acting as if it is small. "I am not," he said. "I would not be with you." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and outside the snow kept moving and inside the lamp kept burning, and it was, she thought, a very good Tuesday. He courted her through January and February with a seriousness and a patience that she found she loved, not the flashy courtship of a man trying to impress, but the steady courtship of a man who understood that trust is built in increments, and that the increments matter. He came on Sundays and they read by the fire, each with a book, and that was comfortable enough to be its own declaration. He helped her mend her south fence when the winter-heaved ground had shifted the posts, not because she asked, but because he was there and saw it needed doing, and they worked side by side in the February cold without ceremony. He left his copy of the Philadelphia Natural History at her house by accident, or what might have been accident, and she read it and left notes in the margins in pencil. And when she gave it back, he read the notes and they talked about them for the better part of a Sunday afternoon. He told her about his family in Ohio, his 4 siblings, his mother who wrote monthly, his father who had died 6 years ago and whose blacksmithing tools he had kept in a trunk in his barn. She told him about her parents in Indiana, her 2 sisters, the particular character of the grief of loving a place you grew up in while also knowing you were not going back to it. They talked about the Comanche and the Apache and the injustice of what the government had done to the people who had lived on these plains long before any of them, and Arthur did not wave it away, or make the convenient arguments that many people made but said plainly that it was wrong, the theft and the violence and the forced removals, and that the least a person could do was say so clearly, which she agreed with and respected. They talked about the future with increasing openness. Not in declarations, that was not the style of either of them, but in the incremental way that people who are moving towards something together begin to talk about it obliquely, and then less obliquely, and then, gradually, with the fullness of two people who have stopped pretending they are not where they are. March came in with wind and the first tentative suggestion of green along the creek banks, and it was March when Arthur asked her to walk out with him on a Sunday afternoon, which was not unusual, except that there was a quality to his manner that Sunday, a contained anticipation, a particular attentiveness, that told her something was different. They walked along the creek where the ice had retreated to the shaded edges, and the water ran clear and fast, and the cottonwoods were starting their first tentative buds, and the sky was the vast pale blue of early Kansas spring that seems to promise more than it can immediately deliver but is beautiful for the promise. He stopped walking at a bend in the creek where a large cottonwood had fallen years ago and become a bench of sorts, worn smooth by weather and use, and he turned to her. "I have been thinking," he said, "about how to say this in a way that is worthy of it, and I have concluded that the best way is just to say it plainly and trust that you understand I mean it with everything I have." She looked at him. Her heart was doing something in her chest that was not quite calm. "Mabel," he said, "I love you. I have loved you since before I understood that was the word for it. I love the way you think and the way you work, and the way you argue about corn prices, and the way you laugh when you think something is genuinely funny, and the way you are honest about the hard things because you think it is better to look at them clearly. I love the life you have built in that kitchen with those books and those herbs and the cow that clearly has opinions. I love all of it." She felt her eyes filling and made absolutely no attempt to stop it because she had decided months ago to stop treating her own emotions as administrative problems. "I am not asking you to forget what you had," he said. "I would never ask that. But I am asking if you would be willing to build something new alongside what you have already built, with me." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a ring, a simple thing, a band of silver with a small turquoise stone that was the blue-green of a desert sky, and held it in his palm. "Will you marry me?" He said. "Mabel Hawthorne, will you do me the considerable honor of marrying me?" She looked at the ring in his palm and at his face above it, and felt the full measure of everything that had led to this moment, the grief and the work and the solitude and the slow, careful building of something real, and she said, "Yes, Arthur Mercer, I will." He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it in the March sunlight, the silver and the turquoise. And then she looked up at him, and he pulled her close, and she let herself be held in the way she had not let herself be held in a very long time, fully and without reservation. And the creek ran past them, and the cottonwood bent in the wind, and the sky went on above them vast and blue and permanently. They walked home along the creek road with her hand in his, which she had not done walked holding someone's hand since Thomas died, and it felt different than she expected, not like a replacement but like something entirely its own, which she thought was the right way for it to feel. Dorothy, when told on Monday morning, cried without apology and then immediately began discussing the wedding, which she had clearly been planning in a provisional way since November, and needed only the official commission to deploy fully. Clara Webb, upon being told, spent a full 30 seconds in a silence that was not speechlessness, but rather the quality of someone receiving excellent news and wanting to feel it properly before speaking, and then said, "I am so glad," in a way that meant it completely. They set the date for June, which gave them enough time to manage the practical arrangements without so much time that the waiting became its own kind of difficulty. There was no courthouse in Harlow Creek, but the Reverend Aldous was entirely willing, and the hotel could manage a dinner afterward, and Dorothy took on the task of organizing both with the competent joy of someone in her element. The spring was busy. Mabel planted her corn, Arthur managed the spring cattle work, and in the evenings between they planned together. They would live on her farm, which was smaller than his but which was hers, and which she was not willing to leave. And this was not even a discussion because Arthur said when she first raised it that of course they would live on her farm. She had built something there that deserved to stay built. And he would sell his land or find a tenant for it and bring his cattle to her pastures, which were good pastures and had room. He said all of this practically, and without any hint of injury to his pride, which she loved him for specifically. They talked about enlarging the farmhouse, which would need it. They talked about the east pasture that could take another 30 head if the summer was good. They talked about whether to build a separate study or simply put another bookshelf in the sitting room, and they argued about it pleasantly for 3 separate evenings before settling on both, which seemed the right answer in retrospect. In April, on a warm afternoon when the prairie was starting to show its spring color, the greening of the buffalo grass, the first wildflowers along the fence lines, Arthur drove out to meet Roy Harrington about the consolidation of his property with Mabel's acreage, which required some legal paperwork and some conversation about easement rights, and Roy Harrington was, as Roy Harrington had always been, difficult. He implied things about the suitability of a widow expanding her land holdings in combination with a rancher that were unkind, and said more about Roy than about either of them. And Arthur handled it the way he handled most things that were unreasonable, steadily, firmly, without losing his temper, with the particular quality of a man who is entirely aware that he is right and does not need the other party's agreement to stay right. He told Mabel about it that evening on her porch, and she listened and said, "Roy Harrington is a man who has confused having opinions with having authority, and no one has sufficiently corrected him on this point." "You could take the post on the town council when it comes up in autumn," Arthur said. She looked at him. "Women do not sit on the town council. Women did not fix the Schoolbell tower either," he said, "until one did." She thought about it, and kept thinking about it, which was how she approached most things she found herself unable to dismiss. May came in warm and full of the particular productive chaos of a farm in spring. Arthur had begun moving his cattle to her eastern pastures, and Senator had developed a strong opinion about the new cows that required diplomatic management. Dorothy had commissioned 3 women in town to help with the wedding dress, which was being made from cream-colored cotton with small embroidered flowers at the cuffs and collar, and it was the most beautiful thing Mabel had put on since the blue wool dress on their first Saturday supper, and she wore it for a fitting in Dorothy's parlor, and stood in front of the mirror and thought, with a clarity that was its own kind of answer to all the questions she had spent the last 3 years asking, "This is the right thing." There was a letter from Arthur's mother in Ohio in May, a letter he showed her with the slightly sheepish expression of a man whose mother writes very directly. His mother, whose name was Eleanor, said in the letter that she had prayed for exactly this for a long time, and that anyone who could make Arthur stop talking about the natural history of the plains long enough to notice someone else must be exceptional, which Mabel found very funny and very endearing. She wrote Eleanor a letter in return, carefully and honestly, which she then showed to Arthur before she sent it, and he read it and looked up and said, "She is going to love you." "Good," Mabel said. "I plan to love her too." June arrived like a door opening onto something bright. The morning of the wedding was warm and clear, with the long golden light of a Kansas summer morning that makes the plains look exactly like what they are, a beautiful, enormous, uncompromising country that has been fought over and settled and built upon, and that will outlast all the people on it, and is magnificent because of that, not despite it. Mabel dressed in Dorothy's parlor with Dorothy and Clara and Dorothy's daughter Nora fussing and loving, and getting slightly in each other's way, and she put on the cream cotton dress and let Dorothy arrange her hair with the tortoiseshell combs and looked at herself in the mirror and did not look for Thomas there, which she had been afraid she might. She looked for herself, and found herself, and was satisfied. The Reverend Aldous married them at the Methodist Church in front of a congregation that was, in practical terms, most of Harlow Creek, because the community had been following this story with the avid interest that small communities give to anything that matters, and this mattered. Arthur stood at the front of the church in a dark coat and a white shirt, and the expression of a man who is precisely where he intends to be. And when Mabel walked up the aisle on Dorothy's husband Samuel's arm, there being no male relative available and Samuel being both willing and considerably less tearful than Dorothy, Arthur watched her with the steady, warm look that she had come to know as the purest expression of who he was. And she felt it from 20 feet away and walked toward it without hesitation. She said her vows looking at him directly, which was the only way she knew how to say important things, and he said his looking at her with the full weight of a man who means every word he is using, and the Reverend Aldous pronounced them man and wife, and Arthur Mercer kissed her in the church in front of all of Harlow Creek, and the bell in the tower rang, because Clara had arranged for 2 of the older boys to pull the rope at exactly the right moment. And it rang out over the plains in the clear June air, and Mabel laughed again, which was by now neither a shock nor a surprise, but simply the sound of a woman who has room for it. The dinner at the hotel was everything Mathilda could make it, which was considerable. There was music, a fiddle and a small harmonium, which was not a symphony orchestra but was exactly right, and there was dancing on the cleared floor, and Dorothy danced with Samuel with the pleasure of people who have been married long enough to know each other's rhythms entirely, and Clara danced with the doctor's young assistant who had been finding reasons to visit the schoolhouse all spring, and Arthur danced with Mabel in the way that he did most things with her. Carefully, attentively, as if she were something worth paying attention to. Happy? He asked, in the way a man asks it when he already knows the answer but wants to hear it said. Extraordinarily, she said, and meant it. Life after the wedding arranged itself with the organic efficiency of 2 competent people who have thought carefully about what they are building and are willing to put the work in. Arthur moved his cattle and brought the best of his equipment and his father's blacksmithing tools, and his books, considerably more books than he had let on, which delighted her, and they merged their domestic lives with a minimum of friction and a maximum of negotiated compromise, which is the practical language of love. They expanded the east bedroom and began plans for the study, which was to be built on the south side of the house where it would get the afternoon light, and Arthur began the framing in September using timber he had milled himself, and Mabel helped on the weekends when the farm work permitted, and they built the room together in the way they had repaired the bell tower in November of the previous year, practically, competently, side by side. In October, Mabel stood for election to the Harlow Creek Town Council. She did this after considerable conversation with Arthur, who was entirely in favor, and after her own considerable internal deliberation, which concluded that Arthur had been right about the Schoolbell Tower and was probably right about this too. Roy Harrington was publicly disapproving. 3 other members of the council expressed private reservations through the medium of their wives, expressing those reservations at the general store, which was less private than they supposed. Clara Webb organized a meeting at the schoolhouse, at which 14 of the 17 women in town who were of voting age attended and discussed the matter with a vigor that Mabel found galvanizing. She won the seat by 9 votes in a town election that had, to that point, never been contested in any meaningful way, and she sat down at the council table for the first time in November with the same composure she had taken up the bell tower a year ago, knowing the work needed doing, prepared to do it. Roy Harrington did not resign, which she had not expected. He simply learned, over the course of 2 council meetings, that Mabel Hawthorne Mercer was not going to be talked over or dismissed, and while he was not gracious about adjusting to this reality, he adjusted. The school got its new roof the following spring. Properly, fully, with good timber and a contribution from the maintenance fund that had been sitting undisturbed since 1875. Clara, when informed, looked at Mabel with an expression of profound gratitude, and then said, with the dry wit she reserved for very good moments, "I am retiring my bucket." The winter of 1879 into 1880 was the winter Mabel understood completely what it meant to be a good husband. It was not the dramatic understanding, the kind that comes with grand gestures, though there were moments of those too, a night when she was ill with a chest cold, and he stayed up with her and read aloud to her in the lamplight until she slept, which was more tenderness than she could hold at once and which made her cry, not from sadness but from the fullness of it. It was the daily understanding, the ordinary revelation, the way he brought her coffee without being asked, because he had learned exactly how she took it. The way he listened to her talk about the farm problems with the same quality of attention he gave to everything. The way he argued with her about things they disagreed about, and they did disagree, about methods and money, and the best way to handle the situation with the Hendersons' fence that kept coming down, without either of them needing to win so much as needing to be understood. She told Dorothy, one afternoon in February by Dorothy's fire, "I had forgotten what it was like to be known by someone, the specificity of being known." Dorothy, who had been married to Samuel for 18 years, nodded with the depth of someone who understood completely. "That is what love is," Dorothy said, "the ordinary remarkable thing of being seen." In April of 1880, on a morning that smelled of new grass and creek water, and the particular wildflower that only bloomed on the south slope of the property for about 10 days each spring, Mabel told Arthur she was expecting. They were at the kitchen table, which had become the place where the most important conversations of their life together happened. It was a good table for that, worn and solid and honest, with the morning light coming through the east window and the smell of coffee and the comfortable presence of a kitchen that was, as Arthur had said, lived in well. She told him, and he put his coffee cup down and looked at her for a moment with an expression she had never seen on him before, which was not surprising because it was the expression of a man receiving news for which he has hoped and which has arrived. He came around the table and held her, and she felt his breath against her hair, and he said, "Mabel," in a way that used her name as the entirety of what he needed to say, and she understood it completely. She wrote to her mother in Indiana and to her 2 sisters, and she wrote to Arthur Mercer in Columbus, Ohio, and Arthur wrote back within the week with a letter so warm and full of love that Mabel read it twice, and then put it in the wooden box she kept her important correspondence in, between Arthur's Christmas book inscription and the children's thank you card from the school. Dorothy, upon being told, held Mabel's hands and looked at her with 20-odd years of friendship and said, "He would be happy for you, Mabel. Thomas, you know that." "I know that," Mabel said, and she did. The summer of 1880 was full and warm and abundant. The corn came in well, and the cattle were healthy, and the east pasture proved exactly as good as they had hoped, and Mabel worked through her pregnancy with the same stubbornness that had sent her up a bell tower in November, though she permitted herself slightly longer rest breaks and accepted Arthur's help with the heavier work without argument, which he considered a profound act of trust, and which she considered simply pragmatic. He worried, in the way that people who love someone worry, and she accepted his worry without dismissing it and without letting it become suffocating, because she was herself, and she was not going to pretend to be otherwise on his account, and he did not want her to. That was the agreement between them, unspoken but solid. She would tell him when she needed something, and he would be there when she did, and neither of them would perform a version of themselves different from the actual one. The study was finished in August, and they spent the last evenings of summer arranging the books together, which turned into an argument about organizational system. His preference was subject matter, hers was by author, and they arrived at a compromise that was, like most good compromises, something neither of them had originally proposed. and the lamplight fell over the books and the new shelves that Arthur had built with the same care he brought to everything he made. And it was one of those evenings that does not announce itself as significant, but that you remember afterward as one of the good ones. A boy. Their son was born on a clear October morning in 1880, when the cottonwoods along the creek had gone to gold, and the air smelled of autumn, delivered by the town doctor with Dorothy in the room and Arthur in the kitchen, doing the particular pacing of a man who has nothing useful to do and is aware of it. When the doctor came to the kitchen and said that Mabel and the baby were well, Arthur sat down with the sudden verticality of a man whose legs have been making a decision without consulting him, and Dorothy told Mabel afterward that she had heard from the hallway a sound from Arthur that was not quite a word, but was unmistakably a prayer of gratitude. They named him Thomas James Mercer. Thomas for the man who had loved Mabel well and left too soon, James for Arthur's father the blacksmith. It was Mabel's idea, and when she told Arthur he was quiet for a moment and then said it was a good name, and the way he said it told her everything about who he was. Arthur held his son for the first time with the absolute focus of a man who understands he is holding something that matters more than anything he has previously held, and little Thomas James blinked up at him with the unfocused dignity of the newly arrived, and Arthur said to him, quietly, "We are going to do right by you," and meant it in every direction at once. Harlow Creek, which had been watching the Mercer household with the fond proprietary interest of a community that considers its people a collective project, celebrated the new baby with the traditional small-town combination of dropped-off food and dropped-in well-wishes that kept Dorothy busy managing arrivals at the door for a full week. Clara brought a hand-embroidered blanket. Eli Pond from the general store contributed a small carved wooden horse. Even Roy Harrington, whose relationship with Mabel had evolved over the past year from bristling opposition to something closer to wary mutual respect, sent over a ham with a card in his wife's handwriting that said congratulations. The years that followed were full years, good years, the kind of years that are not written about in newspapers because they contain no catastrophes, only the ongoing, renewable work of building something worth having. Mabel served on the town council for 6 years, and in that time saw the school properly maintained, and a new library room added to the schoolhouse, and a clean water well dug on the main street that the women of Harlow Creek had been requesting for 12 years. She argued with Roy Harrington regularly and productively, and she came to the conclusion that Roy Harrington was not a bad man, but simply a man who had never been required to look beyond his own experience until someone put a table between them and declined to be invisible. Arthur expanded the cattle operation carefully, not overreaching, building the kind of deliberate, durable business that his father, the blacksmith, would have recognized as sensible. He hired 2 ranch hands, brothers from a Mexican family who had been farming poor land near Salina, and paid them fairly and treated them with the same straightforward respect he brought to everything, which was not universal among Kansas ranchers in 1880, and which the brothers, Pedro and Miguel Reyes, repaid with loyalty and first-rate work. Thomas James grew into a serious, curious boy with his mother's brown eyes and his father's square jaw, and a particular enthusiasm for the natural world that led him, at the age of 4, to bring home a collection of insects in a jar that neither parent felt entirely comfortable about but that both agreed to tolerate on the window ledge of the study, which was the room he liked best because it had the most books. In the spring of 1883, when Thomas James was 2.5 and had developed decided opinions about most things, Mabel told Arthur she was expecting again. This time she told him in the study, in the afternoon light, and he crossed the room to her and held her and said, "Good," in the way that one word can contain everything that matters. Their daughter was born in December of 1883, on a cold, clear night when the stars were enormous over the Kansas plains, and they named her Eleanor Ruth Eleanor for Arthur's mother in Columbus, Ohio, who had by then come to visit twice, and who Mabel loved as she had expected to love her, with the particular warmth of women who recognize in each other the same quality of straightforwardness. Ruth was from Mabel's own mother in Indiana. Alina arrived in the world with tremendous enthusiasm and an immediate strong voice that she kept, and she and Thomas James circled each other for the first several months with the cautious mutual assessment of siblings establishing terms. And then one morning Mabel looked out the kitchen window and saw Thomas James sitting in the yard showing his little sister the insect jar with the gravity of someone passing on important information, and the terms were apparently settled. On a Sunday evening in the spring of 1884, Mabel sat on the porch of the farmhouse she had lived in since 1876, expanded now, warm with lamp light from within, the study's window glowing at the corner, and listened to the sound of Kansas in the evening. The creak of the cottonwoods, the distant low of cattle, the creek running in the dark below the rise. Arthur sat beside her in the second porch chair, Thomas James's wooden horse on the railing where it had been left this morning, and from inside came the sound of two children doing something that was probably fine. She looked out at the land, her 40 acres and the additional 12 that they had purchased the year before, the east pasture where Arthur's cattle moved in the last light, and felt the weight of it, the full good weight of a life that had been built from work and loss and courage and the particular grace of a Tuesday morning in November when she had decided to stop waiting and climb the tower herself. "Arthur," she said. He said, "Do you know what I was thinking about today?" "Tell me," he said. "I was thinking about the morning you rode past the schoolhouse," she said, "before dawn on that Tuesday, and I was up on the tower, and I could have told you I did not need help." "You could have," he agreed. "You didn't need it." "No," she said, "but I am glad I said yes." He reached over in the easy way they had with each other now and found her hand on the armrest and held it. His hand was the same hand she had noticed on the tower in November 1878, large, work-marked, capable. Her hand in it was the same hand she had looked at then, except older, carrying more years. "So am I," he said. The evening settled around them. Inside, Thomas James said something with great authority, and Alina responded with great enthusiasm, and a thump that was probably a book hitting the floor. And Mabel and Arthur looked at each other in the lamplight, and the look said everything that did not need to be said out loud, because it had already been said in every ordinary day they had lived together, in coffee and corn prices and arguments about bookshelves, and the shared weight of grief held carefully, and new love built from honesty. "I should go see what that thump was," Mabel said. "Probably the natural history," Arthur said. "She likes the pictures. She is 11 months old. She is our daughter," he said. "She is already developing opinions about natural history." Mabel laughed, the full, real laugh that came easily now, that had come more and more easily with each passing year, until it was simply part of who she was again, as natural as breathing, and stood from the porch chair and went inside. And Arthur sat for another moment in the spring evening, listening to his wife laugh in the warm house behind him. And the bell tower of the Harlow Creek schoolhouse stood 2 miles north with its new bell quiet in the darkness, and the cottonwoods bent in the evening wind. And the stars came out over Kansas one by one. Arthur Mercer's first word, at 13 months, was not Mama or Papa or any of the usual candidates. It was Belle. She had been brought to the schoolhouse by her mother on a Thursday morning, when Mabel had a council meeting, and the nursery arrangements had fallen through, and she had sat on a blanket in the sun outside the schoolhouse and looked at the tower with Thomas James's focused attention. And when the bell rang for the end of morning lessons, she looked up at it with complete seriousness and said "Bell," as if she had been waiting to identify it. Clara Webb, who witnessed this, wrote it in the schoolhouse register with a small note. First words spoken by the daughter of the woman who fixed the bell. She thought it was worth recording. Mabel, when told, looked at her daughter with the look she had given her since birth, the look of a woman who recognizes, in the person in front of her, someone worth knowing, and said, "Good girl. Now let's learn some more." The Mercer farm in Harlow Creek, Kansas, was by 1886 one of the known places on the road between Salina and the smaller settlements south, known for its well-kept fences and its good cattle, and the two children who helped with the farm work with varying degrees of genuine enthusiasm. And for the woman with the dark hair and the work-marked hands who sat on the town council and spoke plainly, and had fixed the Schoolbell tower herself on a Tuesday in November of 1878. Before any of this had started, when she had simply decided that waiting for someone else to do it was not how she was going to live. Dorothy Crane asked her once, late in the autumn of 1885, sitting by Mabel's fire with their coffee and the comfortable weight of 20-odd years of friendship, if you had known that morning, if you had known what would happen, what the whole story would be, would you have climbed that tower? Mabel considered the question honestly, as she considered everything. I climbed it because it needed climbing, she said. The rest of it, Arthur, and all of it was not why I climbed it. I climbed it because the children needed to get to school on time and no one else was going to do it. She was quiet for a moment. But I am very glad it was Tuesday. And I am very glad it was a well-traveled road. Dorothy smiled. The best things usually are. The fire crackled, and the November wind moved against the house, and from upstairs came the sounds of two children negotiating the terms of bedtime. And in the study, a lamp burned over an open book where Arthur had been reading before he went up to help negotiate the bedtime. And the coffee was hot in their cups. And outside the plains went on forever under the enormous Kansas sky, which had seen everything and forgot nothing and kept on regardless. Which was perhaps why people kept coming to live under it. Not because it was gentle, but because it was honest, and because in an honest country, honest people find each other.